Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the third of the Dean's Lectures for this year. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I pay respects to elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation, and I extend that respect to Indigenous Australians present. So tonight's a special night indeed for our speaker, Professor Gregor Kennedy. He'll be delivering what's known as his inaugural professorial lecture, a traditional public lecture for new professors at the University of Melbourne. Gregor is Pro Vice-Chancellor Educational Innovation at the University and also Professor at the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education. Gregor was promoted to Professor in 2014. As Pro Vice-Chancellor, Gregor leads the University's strategy in curriculum innovation, technology-enhanced teaching, learning and assessment, massive open online courses, learning analytics and the use of physical and virtual teaching and learning spaces. Gregor completed his PhD at the university in 1998. So his PhD was in psychology, but while he undertook it, he was doing research in the Faculty of Education, in the Department of Educational Psychology and Special Education as a research assistant for Erika Frydenberg, an associate professor. The point is, I was his head of department. I think that's when he started to develop an interest in learning and education. It was clear that that was being established, and I've taken great interest in following his career since. But these days, he's an international leader in educational technology research and development, and his critical evidence-based investigations of net generation students have provided significant insight into how staff and students use technology and emerging technology-based tools in higher education. Greg has spent over 15 years conducting and overseeing research and development in educational technology in higher education. His research interests include student motivation and self-regulation, interaction and engagement in digital learning environments, and the use of 3D immersive simulation for learning. He's published widely in these areas and is a past editor of the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology and serves on a number of editorial boards. He's also been involved in a number of major curriculum developments and renewal projects and has led many design and development teams to create technology-enhanced and or enabled courses, subjects, resources. He's also designed educational programs and resources to support a range of educational contexts, including face-to-face, fully online, self-directed, group-based, mobile and blended learning environments. So with all this in mind, I'm delighted to welcome Greg Orr to the front to speak on the topic of students' digital interaction and how we can analyse students' learning behaviours and outcomes based on digital footprints. I've asked my colleague, Professor Richard James, Pro Vice-Chancellor, Academic and Director of the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education, to thank Gregor at the lecture's conclusion. So please join me in welcoming Gregor to the front.
Well, thank you, Field, and thank you to everybody for turning up this evening. And it is lovely to be here, lovely to be able to talk to you, and lovely to see so many familiar faces in the crowd, which is always a little bit daunting, partly because you never like to speak to the home team, but also you hope that you're going to say something that people haven't already heard before. So I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit more of a background. Field's covered a little bit of my background and where I come from. This is really what digital education is for me, and a lot of the activity and the research and the development that I do is based on looking at the ways in which technologies are used in classroom-based environments and the way in which different types of tools and technologies and curriculum designs, learning designs are used in class. I focus mainly on the higher education context. I really like this New Yorker cartoon because it sort of is of a time and an era where I started my research and an interest in educational technology about 1997, 1998. The laptop here is the kind of laptop that I used to do my PhD on. People would remember the brick mobile phones here. I also like this cartoon because it represents what is some of the good things about higher education with the champagne cork going off. little bit of gambling in the back row. I'm not entirely sure what's going on in the front row there. There seems to be some money changing hands. I'm not sure you can see it. A noughts and crosses game or some sort of love letter. I'm not too sure what that's all about. I also look at the ways in which technology is used out of the classroom environment. So the ways in which it's used in things in places like library settings, which are increasingly becoming digital environments. And I look at everything from the glow of the interface, the way in which individuals interact with technology very much at the screen level, and also the ways in which we use technology in social cultural contexts, in sometimes in sort of strange and odd ways in social cultural contexts where we don't look at the play so much as we look at the play mediated by the interface. And most of my work in the past, most of my work in the past has been conducted in health science education. I love this New Yorker cartoon because I still can't quite work out whether or not the elephant is looking forward to the operation or whether or not is a little bit bemused or a little bit scared by it. And I like the idea of an elephant getting some rhinoplasty. So that's a little bit about me and my background, but really the focus of the talk is the way in which these technologies that are increasingly pervading our lives are working for us in teaching and learning and assessment. So many of you in the audience would be very familiar with these technologies in your professional work and your everyday lives. So in terms of the university environment or a school-based environment, large systems like Blackboard, enterprise teaching and learning systems, with bolt-ons like lecture capture systems or plagiarism detection systems, things like this, that really are core to the enterprise of teaching and learning these days. So that they deliver content, they deliver assessments, they enable discussion and those kind of things. In addition to those kind of core enterprise systems, there are the social networking systems, so things like Twitter or Facebook, blogs, things like YouTube, which increasingly universities and other institutions are adding to their portfolio of technologies that are, as I said, pervasive and firmly part of the educational landscape. Tools like Google and Wikipedia that students routinely go to, and I'll speak about that in a little bit of time. And then more boutique technologies like Smartsparrow, which is a company that was formed in University of New South Wales, which designs interactive simulations, which are then embedded in things like learning management systems. And finally, Field mentioned in his introduction, things like Coursera, massive open online courses, which are really the technology of the day. And these things are used to these technologies are used to deliver, to encourage, to support, to foster teaching, learning and assessment. And one of the great things for educators and particularly for researchers interested in educational technology, a truly wonderful thing about these tools is most of them leave an electronic trace of what students do in their online behaviour. They track what students do online. So of course we're in this sort of slightly odd situation of teaching our students about the classic dystopian text by George Orwell while simultaneously providing them with a real-life case study of what Orwell was really talking about. But let's not go there just at the moment. This is really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the digital traces and what these systems do. Large systems like Blackboard or boutique simulations, 3D immersive environments or things like Coursera that are really collecting huge amounts of data and they have that data in big buckets, and then what we're interested in as researchers and educators is how we can use that data, how we can parse it, how we can mine it, how we can manipulate it, how we can analyse it in some way, and then how we can use it for education and learning. And so with the title of the talk, it's really for me about seeing these digital footprints in these big data sets. When those buckets are filled with data from these large systems that are continually harvesting data, there sits a repository of data. And what I'm interested in, and part of my team are interested in, and numbers of people around the world are interested in how we can see that what students are doing in those big data sets. And really that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, how we can see students' digital footprints in these data and what we might do with that. So the question that's really going to guide my talk is, how can following students' footprints in digital environments tell us something meaningful about learning? And I want to sort of start that discussion by going back to where I started with some of the leaders in the field when I started back in 1997, 1998. A guy called Tom Reeves, who's an American, was sort of the grandfather of educational technology for me. And in the Australian context, a guy called John Hedberg, who was also one of the leading figures in educational technology research and development. And prior to this book, where they published a very influential book called Evaluating Educational Technology Systems. Prior to the release of that book, they said similar things along these lines, which was really that when you look at the traces of what students are doing in these digital learning environments, and when they can go wherever they want and do whatever they want in any sequence, so it's not a really structured experience for them, detecting interpretable pathways to find meaning in those pathways is almost impossible. And so I thought of that as something of a challenge when I first started out in my research and development career. And I suppose looking back now, it's sort of surprising in a way that Reeves and Hedberg from an educational technology tradition sort of ignored in a way some of the work that had been going on in this area for quite some time. People might be familiar with intelligent tutoring systems, artificial intelligence in education, or educational data mining, that from the 70s really emerged. Even though it's quite a young discipline or a young field, there was a bit of work in this area. But I suppose at the heart of what Tom Reeves and John Hedberg were saying, or one of the fundamental issues that was facing them when they were saying you can find it difficult or almost impossible to determine these sequences, at the most basic level, the data traces that are coming out of these large educational teaching and learning systems, digital systems, at that most basic level, the big data that comes from these systems is fundamentally a behavioural record of what students are on about. So the number of clicks, the time they spend on task, how many times they download stuff, how many times they log into the LMS or log out, or their sequence of movements. These are fundamentally behavioural rather than cognitive sort of elements. Now, I need to be careful about that because while behaviour does not equal cognition, there are, of course, some responses that the systems track that can be imbued with this notion of what students are thinking. So there's a couple up there, but the one that I use quite often is when you're designing multiple choice questions often have a distractor item in them. So you know the answer is C, but you put in B there because if students fail to carry the one or they misunderstand this concept, then they'd choose B. So in a way, when students choose B, you've got an idea of what the misconception, an idea of their thinking when they make that choice. But leaving that aside, much of the data that we collect out of these big systems, that kind of cognitive element is absent from what we're collecting. And that is the fundamental rub about collecting these big data sets, and the fundamental rub about much of the learning analytics research. We often need to make assumptions about what is students' intent, what their motivation is, and what their strategies are. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So what I'm saying is we cannot be sure of what's in students' minds when they're really engaging with these kind of activities. And I suppose, and perhaps you have seen, some of these kind of systems in your everyday life. I was talking to a colleague the other day about how Coles remarkably knows what she's going to buy based on her purchases over the last 6 months. And similarly with me on Amazon, I bought a present for my son when he was born, and Amazon still remembers this. I bought more than one present for my son, but he's a lovely kid. But from this, there's clearly an odd one out. Or I don't know if anyone remembers Microsoft Paperclip. I put this one up for all the doctoral students in the room. It looks like you're writing a thesis. Would you like help to get the thesis written or just do research without help? But this, Microsoft Paperclip was incredibly annoying. And it is because it's making assumptions based on you look like you're writing a letter and it pops up and tries to provide you with advice. I'm actually not entirely sure what, the behavioural response of a student to bring up that Microsoft Paperclip might be. Maybe really heavy, sort of, followed by silent weeping, at the... Anyway, that's probably a bit harsh. So back to the question that, keeping that behavioural versus cognitive element in mind, how can we follow students' footprints in digital learning environments? And I want to give you 3 examples of the kinds of things that I think might be useful to think about in this context. The first example is from a project that I call Cognition and Interactivity. It's 2 of my closest colleagues, Barney Delgado and Sue Bennett, who I work with on this. This is a screenshot, and this is an image of a brain. Now, the reason that this screenshot is here and the reason that the image of the brain is here is that when we designed this study originally, Barney had the cracking idea of why don't we put students in an MRI scanner as they're completing an interactive multimedia task, which we did. But I'm not going to report on that today. And the reason why I'm sure there's people in the room that have designed interactive multimedia. This is a pretty appalling interface to interactive multimedia, but the reason that it's so appalling is because when putting people in scanners, you've got to remove all the distracting things from the interface. So that's sort of an explanation. I'll report a little bit on a study that we did outside the scanner with some students up at the University of Wollongong. And the question that we were looking at is how do we design interactive multimedia, and can we look at the way in which students use those and look at their digital traces? And can we find something out about their learning strategies and their cognitive processes and their outcomes? So we had 2 learning conditions. I'm going to have to take you through a little bit about how we set up the study. 2 learning programs, one which was an observational program, one was explorational, and I'll tell you about them in a second, and 2 content areas so we could do a reverse design. Global warming and blood alcohol concentration. So here's the observation. This is a classic sort of tutorial page-turning type program. There's a number of content screens at the front, gives you an introduction to the area and some terminology. And then students are faced with a number of screens where the parameters are manipulated for them and they see an output, so that there's manipulation of a parameter, they see the impact of it. Manipulation of a parameter, see the impact. The important thing is that the students don't manipulate it themselves. They're just simply shown it. They don't actually do anything to the interface other than clicking forward. So that's the observation condition. The exploration condition is exactly the same, except it's a genuine simulation, a conceptual simulation task. So the same content at the front, same terminology, same introduction, but then we ask students to go through these predict, observe, explain tasks where they themselves alter the values and work out what they want to change, and then see the impact of altering the values on the outcome. So it's a classic predict, observe, explain simulation task. Each student completed both conditions, we turned them around, and there was a pre and post test, and we of course logged their digital footprints. And so our expectations was of course that students in the discovery-based exploration simulation condition, because they're doing much more sort of deeper thinking and elaborative processing, and we'd see that in the scanner, they would learn much more from doing that rather than just attending to what was happening on the screen. And we were completely underwhelmed when we got the results. We looked at global warming and there was no statistical difference between the 2 groups, and there was only a very modest difference for blood alcohol simulation. I want you to ignore the fact that the understanding of global warming was so low. We've got a floor effect there. But then again, most of our politicians don't understand global warming. So what we did when we were disappointed by this result, we looked at we noticed that there was quite a bit of variation in the post-test scores. There was for the simulation, for the exploration condition. And then we used a statistical technique called eyeballing. And we looked at the logs of what students in that exploration condition were doing. And some of those students seemed to be much more systematic in their approach, and others seemed very random in their approach. And so what we did is we characterised those learning behaviours, those behavioural interactions, using a simple rule. And the rule was this. For the systematic ones, they were the students who looked at those cycles of simulation, those predict, observe, explain cycles. On each one of those, they changed one variable, saw its impact. Changed one variable, saw its impact. Changed one variable, saw its impact. So they were very systematic in their approach to the investigation of what was going on. And all the other individuals in that exploration condition who were randomly changing multiple variables and not really seeing what was going on were called non-systematic. And then there were the students who were in the straight tutorial page-turning observation condition. And then we looked at the analysis again. And what we found is that those folks who are in the systematic condition suddenly, in the post-test, were understanding the content material much more, and significantly more than both the non-systematic and the observation condition, and interestingly, those non-systematic and observation condition students were exactly the same. So there's something going on here. What does it show us? Well, the first thing that it shows us, and I expect many of you in the room will already know this, is that students don't do what we want them to do. That when we present them with tasks that we think are well-designed educationally, there is an implicit assumption that they're going to sort of follow the script or follow the rules. And the work that I've done over numbers of years now, particularly with my partner in crime, Terry Judd, who I used to work with in the Faculty of Medicine, time and time again, we see from the digital footprints that students leave in these digital learning environments is that they fail to conform to the pedagogical intent of the task that we, the designers, or we, the educators, design for them. Now, again, this might not be so surprising to many of you, but when we started doing this work, there was sort of quite a vehement belief, particularly in the educational technology community, that if we design tasks in a particular way, based on solid educational principles, that somehow magically students would learn because the task would be designed in a way to make them learn. But what we found, Terry and I, is that often students don't do this. So in medicine, we found that first-year students, despite being directed to authoritative medical resources, 70% of the time for their academic searches would use Google and Wikipedia only. We find routinely that students under-engage in a task or don't complete a task, an interactive task. They pull out of the task when they think that they've got it and routinely miss out on the last 20% of the task where the denouement of the task, where the end and the conclusion of the task is there designed for students for it to be revealed. We routinely find that in collaborative learning tasks, students don't collaborate. We find that 25% of students create 75% of the content in collaborative learning and tasks supported by wikis. So at the time where I started doing this work with Terry, we were certainly holding up this window, this mirror to, not a window, a mirror, to the community saying, don't presume just that we're designing tasks that students will learn from. But in the context of this talk, what I think that first example shows is that we can find meaningful patterns of students' behaviour using their digital footprints that are interpreted through the lens of the learning design of the task, and that those different patterns suggest different strategies or approaches from the student, and they suggest different types of cognitive engagement with the task, and they're associated with different types of learning outcomes, and I think that that's useful. So the second example that I want to show you takes that from the micro level, that idea from the micro level, up to a more macro and curricular level, and I want to talk about massive open online courses. So many of you would know these online courses. The world was taken by storm by MOOCs in 2012. Many universities started off with these free online courses, subjects really, that ran for 6 to 8 weeks. And thousands, tens of thousands of students enrolled in these free courses that were made available by universities. The University of Melbourne was the first university to do this in Australia. We've had 750,000 students enrol or express an interest in our courses, and about half of those students have started one of our courses. So this is a phenomenon. One of the reasons that the university, just one of many reasons that the university got involved in Coursera, with Coursera and offering these courses, was this idea of looking at the data that was available from these tens of thousands of students and trying to work out what was going on. And around this data set, the Learning Analytics Research Group was formed. And a lot of them are sitting there, and there is others in the room. So that the university has a group that comes from a whole range of disciplinary backgrounds that looks at these data and tries to work out what's going on. I want to talk about a particular study. Carlton, Linda and Paula are in the room. And I also want to acknowledge the other members of the Learning Analytics Research Group, because it was really a joint effort to come to some understanding about how we could use these data and what we could use them for. And what I want to show you is, again, a comparative study. We have 2 MOOCs here. One is Principle of Macroeconomics. The second is discrete optimisation. Now, macroeconomics is a relatively traditional MOOC or course. It runs about 8 weeks, 9 weeks. It's got a traditional linear structure. The course opens. Material is progressively released over those weeks of the course. And assessments are staged so that they happen at various times in the course. It's a classic put it up, discuss, put it up, discuss kind of course. It's a bit rude, but you get the point. Discrete optimisation, because Carlton's in the room, is a fantastic course. Discrete optimisation was a very innovative course. It had an open structure. From day one, all the materials were available to students, including all of the assessments. Everything was up there online for the students to mess around with. Students could take assessments in any order at any time and could go back and repeat assessments whenever they want. So 2 very different curriculum designs is the point here. So what we did is we measured, we had so much data, we measured a bunch of stuff, but I just want to draw your attention to one thing that we measured, which was how frequently different types of students watched and revisited video lectures across the course. So a classic thing in MOOCs is to provide these 8 to 12-minute videos that students can watch. And what we were interested in is, given these 2 courses, is how frequently students went to those videos and how often they came back and revisited those videos. And the way we did this is through state transition diagrams. So I'm going to have to give you a little bit of an explanation about what state transition diagrams, and close your ears, Carlton, because I'm probably going to get it wrong. State transition diagrams just simply refer to concepts in the course or structures within the course, and all they show is the way in which individual students move between those structures of the course. The grey lines are sort of foot traffic. It's sort of the width, the thickness of the grey lines represent the foot traffic between videos. So these thick lines mean more foot traffic and the thin lines mean less foot traffic. It's just the degree to which students assert the strength of the transition between different parts of the course. In this case, it's the movement between videos. Another thing to note is that if you're thinking about above the 2 circles here, which represents the different conceptual constructs in the course, above the video means moving forward, and, above the circle means moving forward, and below the circle means moving backwards. So really it's just like looking at students go down different paths, and the heavier the footfall, the wider the path, basically, is the way in which state transition diagrams work. So up here I've got different types of users, and I've got the 2 courses, macroeconomics and discrete optimisation. The different types of users are the guys that went into the course, they did no assessment. The guys that went in, participated, didn't do so well. Those that did okay, and those that got a high distinction. They're just the different types of users in the course. The first thing that you'll notice, hopefully anyway, is that the thickness of the line increases as you do better in the course. Is that the foot traffic between videos as you go down to those that do well is greater, and for both courses. The second thing that you'll notice is that students who do better in the course are significantly more likely to go back and revisit stuff. So if you're only doing not that well, you're not going back that much, but as you do better, you start to return to material more often. But the kicker is if you compare discrete optimisation to macroeconomics, you should also notice that folks on this side of the line are revisiting material much, much more, significantly more anyway, than those guys in macroeconomics. You can see that from the thickness of the lines underneath the circles. So what does this show us? I suppose again it sort of repeats what I was speaking to you about previously at the micro level of learning design, but at a broader curriculum design level, at a macro level. The patterns of engagement, we can see these patterns of engagement that reflect different learning strategies or approaches that are related to learning outcomes. And it shows you how when we design curriculum structures, it impacts on what we would consider quite important study approaches, the idea that students should go back and revisit their work. And it's not that macroeconomic students didn't have the option of going back and looking at videos. They were all available for them to go back. They simply didn't do it, and it was partly, we think, associated with the structural design of the course. Now, it's important to notice that there's a question of chicken and egg here, because is it that students who did well in the course are more likely to go back and return and revisit videos, or is it that by revisiting videos, you're more likely to do well in the course? But despite that, by comparing macroeconomics to discrete optimisation, we still see the influence of curriculum here. All right, I always like to have a so what slide in my presentations. And so the so what is, well, we can see all these patterns and we can see these behavioural markers and we can associate those with learning strategies and cognition and maybe even learning outcomes. But what can we do with them once we've got them established? And that's the last example that I want to show you. And I apologise to some people who might have seen this example before. This is a team that I'm associated with and have been involved with for many years, and reflects the way in which, in educational technology anyway, you need to move beyond education to get some things done. So James, Ioana, Stephen, Patorn, Siddhanthi and Yun are all part of a team in computing and information systems and also otolaryngology as part of the University of Melbourne, who have been working on 3D immersive environments for surgical simulation for education and training. So here's the setup. 3D immersive, haptically rendered simulation environment. Sounds like a mouthful. What it is, here's Yatsik here, is one of our surgical fellows. He's got 3D glasses on and he's looking into a bone behind your ear, what's called the temporal bone, which is directly behind you here. The 3D glasses allow him to have a 3D rendered view of space from the screen, and he's holding something which is called a haptic device, a Falcon haptic device here. And what he's doing is that's connected to the drill that you can see in the three-dimensional space, virtually connected to the drill. So when he moves that haptic device, it moves in the 3D space. So he's sitting there performing surgery on somebody's temporal bone behind their ear in a 3D rendered environment. And the haptic device is a force feedback device, which means that when he hits a bone, it pushes back. It feels like he's hitting something hard. If he goes into an air pocket, it's like violet crumble, or it's got air pockets in it. He drops in and he feels the force of the drop into the... If he hits a softer structure, it's much more soft. That's the idea of a haptic device. So this is a surgical simulator that we've developed over a number of years. So the learning design of the task is to learn how to complete a cortical mastoidectomy. So in more common language, it is drill away the bone behind your ear and please do it safely, which is not that easy, I can tell you. But it's basically a procedural simulation task. Students have to develop a range of skills in completing this task: psychomotor skills about using their hands, clinical anatomy, procedural skills, decision-making skills, and clinical decision-making skills. And within this 3D immersive simulated environment, we are collecting buckets of information. So a whole lot of different types of metrics about students' digital footprint within that 3D immersive environment. So where the tool is in 3D dimensional space, what its orientation is, how much force they're using, how far away they are from the facial nerve or other critical anatomical structures. The surgical stroke length, which is really important to us, which is how long and smooth their strokes are and what directions they are. The rotation of the bone, which is about basically moving, how they move the anatomy, the patient's head, a whole range of things. And this is quite important. So it's 48 metrics that we're sucking out of the simulator, and we're recording them 15 times per second. So you can imagine over the course of 45 minutes, buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets of data. So what we wanted to do is work out whether or not we could use these digital footprints to provide more personalised feedback to surgical trainees. And not just feedback along the lines of you've hit the facial nerve and severely paralysed somebody's face for the rest of their life, but more, or you should have completed this stage before this other stage, but more nuanced feedback, more qualitative feedback, feedback that a surgeon would sit on the shoulder of a trainee and say in the operating theatre, things like you could use a bit more force here, or slow down, or drill more parallel to the dura, or those kind of things. So what we did, and to be fair, what James and Ewan and Siddhanthi and Ioana and everybody except me did, was develop models using really, really sophisticated data mining techniques and machine learning techniques. Develop these sophisticated models of expert and novice behaviour within this surgical simulation environment. And then we use those models to provide feedback to users. So a new student comes into the system, they have a trajectory of behaviour. When they become more like a novice and doing it for long enough, we provide them with some sort of feedback. Another way of representing that is that there's Yahtzee again, buckets of data, very sophisticated data mining and machine learning techniques. We developed a separate system that times and tunes and stages the feedback so we don't become like Microsoft Paperclip basically, and then some audio advice to the user. And so finally we wanted to, of course, test this system. So we had 24 medical students. They had some knowledge of anatomy but not of surgery. We gave them a little course on how to use the simulator, and then we did a simple two-group comparison where one group had the simulation and feedback and another group didn't have the feedback. What you can see here is the percentage of the procedure completed, and up here on the y-axis is the degree to which the behaviour of the behaviour of the novice is like that of an expert. And you can see a really strong, significant difference between the two groups here. Now, in a way, this is not surprising. One group got feedback, one group didn't get feedback. But I would remind you that this is all completely automated. It is completely done on the fly, in real time, based on the behaviour of the individual user within the system. So it's a completely automated feedback system based on the digital traces of the user within that system. And the other thing is it gave us quite positive feedback from the students themselves. It reminded me to be gentle near structures. It was particularly helpful in particular times. It gave me greater confidence to go faster. Not sure that we probably... Although I am told by Stephen, the surgical expert, that there are times where you want to encourage students to go faster, that they're too tentative. Don't know about that. But the feedback was very positive. So, where does this leave us? And I know that Field wants to get out and have a drink, so I'm going to try and wrap this up in the next 2 or 3 minutes. So I think that what it tells us is that despite some of the protestations from the educational technology community some time ago, it really shows us that the impossible is possible. There was this idea 15 years ago, particularly in the educational technology community, that if we didn't have data that was structured, that if we didn't have a system that we knew what the system was like going in, or to put it another way, if we had a system whereby students could go wherever they want in any direction, then we would never really be able to work out what they were thinking, or hard to work out what they were doing, let alone what they were thinking while they were doing it. I think that the research that we've done and others have done over the last 10 to 15 years started with educational data mining, but with others in the 70s and 80s, has shown that we can find, through these sequences, interpretable pathways that help us understand something about what individual students are doing and also more generally about teaching and learning. So this, I think, is possible. And I want to go back to the start where I set up the talk and think about what the implications of this. In this slide, I've got this sort of the broad education and learning at the end of the slide. And I just want to give you 4 ideas that somewhat repeat what I've already said, but 4 ideas to take away with you. The first is what I've said before, that we can, by following students' footprints in these digital environments, we can understand how students are approaching learning tasks and the curriculum more broadly. And this is not so much about whether or not students understand a particular concept or principle. A lot of intelligent tutoring system work has been invested with the idea of trying to work out whether or not students got something right or wrong and then providing them with a hint or some feedback or some other remediation. This is not really focused on doing that. What I've tried to show you today is that through these traces and looking at students' footprints, we can understand their learning and study strategies when they're faced with various online learning tasks and the curriculum that we present to them online. And knowing this from a researcher's point of view, knowing how students approach learning tasks and their studies gives us incredibly valuable insight into their cognitive and learning processes, which we can then link to their learning outcomes. And this is an incredible boon for educational researchers. For me, when I first thought about this in 1997-98 with Terry Judd, I applied for a small ARC grant to look at motivation and self-regulation in digital learning environments. And I spent the entire time thinking about this problem rather than anything to do with motivation and self-regulation. And it really became something that I've followed for the last 15 or 16 years. It's an amazing resource for us as educational researchers. But equally important, knowing how students approach these learning tasks is incredibly important for teachers, for educators and educational designers, because we can see in minutiae, in fine detail, how the educational tasks that we create for students, that we lovingly prepare for students, we can see how they're working. We can see how they're going well, the positives, we can see how they're not going so well, the negatives. And they also give us an idea about how we might want to change those tasks. So in a way that we can encourage students through the design of tasks to go down pathways that are more productive, that are more adaptive, that are more useful to them educationally. And the last bit sort of relates to that, which is knowing how students approach learning tasks is incredibly useful for us for designing interventions with students in digital learning environments. Even in these really messy, open, ill-structured digital learning environments, I hopefully have shown you how we can construct learning analytics and digital footprints and analyses of digital footprints that can form the basis for students providing individual feedback to students, how we can adapt learning tasks to individual students' needs, and how we can tailor support for students in digital learning environments. And looking to the future, this is very much the focus of what we're doing in the Science of Learning Research Centre here at the Graduate School of Education, a special research initiative of the ARC that we've been working on for 18 months, 2 years. It's got 2 years to run. It's with the University of Melbourne, University of Queensland and ACER, among other institutions that are partners in this, many other institutions. And my particular work there with Jason, who's sitting up the back there, is what we're trying to do is move this on from sort of study strategies to try and work out if we can really, through digital traces and other types of measures, whether we can see confusion within digital learning environments, which is quite an ambitious task, and whether we can see this through students' digital footprints, with a view to providing them with feedback on what they're confused about, but also with a view to providing them with advice about how they themselves can regulate their own study approaches when they get into trouble. So I want to conclude by suggesting that the future is bright. I started out by saying that educational technology is here. It's very much part of our landscape, and aside from the fact that these technologies can support and enhance and be used to really lead to generative learning environments for students, they also have with them the added bonus, from my point of view, of having these big buckets of data that we can start to really unpack. And so I think that the data generated by these environments provide really wonderful opportunities for us to better understand learning and education. And I think there's a lot of work to be done here. I think we've made a start, but this is a young and emerging field. But the future, I think, is very bright. And I suppose this last slide gives you an indication of what I think that future will involve. It'll involve a range of people. It will involve people with very different levels, different sets of expertise. Educators, data miners, programmers, statisticians, psychometricians, Sandra says edumetricians, and educational technologists. And I think it's only really by bringing those folks together will we be able to create really valuable meaning out of students' footprints in digital learning environments. So thanks very much, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Gregor. That was good, eh? I think I can say the future is indeed very bright for educational research, but also for the University of Melbourne. What you've seen this evening is just a glimpse of Gregor Kennedy and the work he's doing, a mere glimpse. At the Centre for the Study of Higher Education, on a day-to-day basis, we benefit from Gregor's intelligence and his insights and his energy, and we experience his humour as well. Rather than reflect on Gregor's presentation, I'd rather tell you a little bit about what you haven't seen of Gregor's work. Because Gregor, of course, is juggling a very large, complicated and impressive portfolio of responsibilities. Not only is he an active educational researcher, leading a research group and research programs, as you've seen this evening, but he's also in charge of setting strategy around educational innovation for the university as a whole. And that's no mean task in the contemporary era. So Gregor is juggling the life of being a leading edge researcher with being a leader, manager, strategist who's helping shape the University of Melbourne's future. This is no mean feat. It means in part that the research has to be relevant to contemporary educational issues for the university. So I guess the work that you haven't seen that Gregor's doing and the contribution that he's making is one of making these kinds of connections. This means the research has to be real, live, contemporary, practical. And making connections between educational research and day-to-day policy and practice is not easy, as the educators in the room would understand. You can't hide, I guess is what I'm trying to say, when you're a researcher and a leader, manager, strategist. So Gregor is doing a fine job at the moment of steering the University of Melbourne through a very important era in which digital learning has not only pedagogical implications for us, but commercial and reputational implications, as you can imagine, as well. He certainly is doing a fine job. And in many ways, Field, I'd say that Gregor's connection between research and practice represents the very kind of ethos that you've been building in the Graduate School of Education overall. Now, speaking of Field, at the outset, I think he not too subtly claimed some role in Gregor's career development. That's the Dean's way. I wouldn't be so crass, of course, but I was sitting there listening to Gregor and feeling gratified that I'd had the foresight to encourage him to come to the Centre for the Study of Higher Education. On behalf of all of the people in the room, Gregor, I'm sure I can offer you heartiest of thanks for a fascinating presentation and, as I say, a glimpse into your academic world. Thank you.